He was the most dangerous conqueror in the kingdom, and he came to our estate to marry my perfect, arrogant sister. My family ordered me to hide in the shadows, just like I always did. But when the terrifying king walked into the brilliantly lit hall, he didn't even look at his bride. He walked straight past her, stopped right in front of my hiding spot, and whispered a single word, "Mine." Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The grand cathedral doors groaned open and silenced the murmuring crowd. High brightness flooded the vast stone chamber. Clear, cinematic lighting cascaded through the towering stained glass windows. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the tense air. Audrey stood silently behind the massive marble pillars. She was young, strikingly beautiful, and quietly resilient. Her family had ordered her to stay completely out of sight. Today was not her day. Today belonged exclusively to her older sister. Stella stood in the center of the radiant room. She wore a gown woven from imported gold thread. Her chin was tilted upward in an arrogant display of confidence. She was the prized daughter of the Sterling bloodline. She was the one chosen to become the next queen. Everyone in the kingdom knew the absolute power of the incoming monarch. King Julian ruled the northern territories with an iron grip. His reputation was forged in brutal winters and endless wars. Now, he had come south to claim his promised mate. Audrey held her breath as heavy footsteps echoed across the polished floor. The royal guard entered first in flawless formation. Then, the Alpha King finally crossed the threshold. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobility. King Julian was athletically built and breathtakingly handsome. He possessed a warrior's flawless physique. There was nothing bulky or monstrous about his imposing frame. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of an apex predator. His sharp jawline caught the intense, vivid light of the hall. His dark eyes swept over the room with absolute authority. Audrey pressed her back firmly against the cold stone pillar. She just wanted this terrifying ceremony to be over. She wanted to return to the quiet sanctuary of the library. She had learned long ago that survival meant remaining invisible. Her resilient spirit was forged through years of quiet neglect. Her beauty was a secret she kept carefully hidden beneath plain fabrics. Stella took a bold step forward to greet the king. She flashed a rehearsed, seductive smile. She dipped into a graceful curtsy. The entire court waited for King Julian to offer his hand. They waited for the legendary Alpha to accept his new bride. Julian stopped walking. He stood mere inches away from the waiting Stella. But he did not look down at her. He did not offer his hand. He did not even acknowledge her presence. Instead, his broad chest heaved slightly. He drew in a deep, deliberate breath. A visible tremor ran through his powerful shoulders. His dark eyes widened in sudden realization. The scent hit him like a physical blow to the chest. It was faint, but it was absolutely intoxicating. It smelled like wild rain and sweet jasmine. It completely overpowered the heavy perfumes worn by the nobles. Stella noticed his hesitation and nervously cleared her throat. "My king," she whispered softly. Julian completely ignored her. He turned his head slowly toward the shadows of the colonnade. His gaze cut through the vast, brilliantly lit hall. He locked onto the exact pillar where Audrey was hiding. Audrey felt a sudden chill race down her spine. She held her breath and squeezed her eyes shut. She prayed to the ancestors that he had not noticed her. But the heavy, rhythmic sound of his boots began again. He was not walking toward the throne. He was not walking toward Stella. He was walking directly toward the edge of the room. The crowd parted nervously to clear his path. Murmurs of utter confusion filled the silent hall. Stella spun around in shock. Her face flushed dark red with sudden humiliation. "Julian," she called out, forgetting her formal manners. He did not stop. Audrey opened her eyes and realized the shadow was gone. The towering figure of the Alpha King stood directly in front of her. The high brightness of the hall illuminated his intense expression. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He stared down at her beautifully defiant face. He studied the stubborn, resilient set of her jaw. Audrey froze entirely under his burning scrutiny. She expected him to demand her immediate execution for eavesdropping. She expected anger or absolute indifference. She did not expect the raw emotion blazing in his dark eyes. He slowly raised a strong, scarred hand. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her trembling cheek. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in her chest. "Mine," he whispered. The word hung in the air like a heavy curtain. "Mine." The silence in the hall turned from respectful to suffocating. Stella's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. She stepped forward and her heavy gold skirts hissed against the stone. "Julian, you are mistaken," she hissed and her voice cracked with desperation. "That is just my younger sister. She is nothing." Lord William Sterling finally found his voice and shuffled toward the Alpha King. The light caught the beads of sweat forming on the old man's brow. "My king, there has been a profound misunderstanding," William stammered. "Audrey is not part of the treaty. She is merely a shadow in this house." Julian did not turn his head to look at the father. He did not acknowledge the sister's trembling outrage. His entire world had shrunk to the size of the girl in front of him. Audrey felt the heat radiating from his massive, athletic frame. The cinematic brightness of the hall made every detail of him sharper. She saw the flecks of gold in his dark, predatory eyes. She saw the way his pulse thrummed in his powerful neck. He was a force of nature dressed in royal black silk. "Do you think I cannot smell my own soul?" Julian's voice was a low growl. He took another step and forced Audrey back against the cold marble. His large hand remained on the pillar just inches from her ear. He was claiming the space around her and claiming the air she breathed. Audrey looked up at him and her heart hammered like a trapped bird. She refused to look away. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "I am not a soul," Audrey whispered and her voice was thin but steady. "I am a daughter of this house and I was told to remain hidden." Julian's eyes darkened with a mixture of possessiveness and sudden fury. He turned his head slightly toward Lord William. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You hit her?" Julian asked and the threat was as sharp as a blade. "You kept my fated mate in the shadows while offering me that?" He gestured vaguely toward Stella without even looking at her. Stella let out a strangled cry of indignation and shame. The court whispered behind their hands and their eyes were wide with scandal. She was not the chosen one. William pleaded and his hands shook. "The bloodline of the heir flows through Stella." Julian stepped away from Audrey and the sudden loss of his heat made her shiver. He walked toward William with the terrifying grace of a warrior. Every eye in the room followed his broad, muscular shoulders. He stood a full head taller than the lord of the house. "The moon decides the heir," Julian stated and his voice echoed in the rafters. "And the moon has chosen the girl in the shadows." He turned back to Audrey and his expression softened by a fraction. It was not a gentle look, but it was no longer lethal. "Go," he commanded and his eyes locked onto hers. "Get rid of these rags. Dress in the finest silk this house possesses." Audrey didn't move. She stood her ground and her chin remained high. "I have no fine silks," she said simply. "Everything of value in this house belongs to Stella." A deadly quiet settled over the nobility. Julian's jaw tightened in a low, rumbling sound started in his chest. It was the sound of a wolf preparing to tear a world apart. He looked at the trembling servants lining the walls. "You," he pointed to a young maid. "Find the finest gown in this palace. If it belongs to the sister, take it. If it is a family heirloom, seize it. My queen will not stand in the light wearing the clothes of a servant." Stella collapsed into a chair and her breath came in ragged gasps. "You can't do this," she screamed, and tears began to ruin her makeup. Julian ignored her as if she were a buzzing insect. He returned to Audrey and his hand hovered near her face. He didn't touch her this time, but the intention was clear. He was waiting. He was hungry for her recognition. Audrey felt the weight of 500 years of tradition breaking. She felt the eyes of her father burning with resentment. She felt the venomous gaze of her sister. But more than that, she felt the magnetic pull of the man before her. He was dangerous, he was a tyrant, and he was hers. "Why me?" she asked, and her voice was a mere breath of air. Julian leaned down until his lips were brushing against her ear. "Because the moment I entered this hall, the world stopped turning. I did not see the gold. I did not see the throne. I only saw you." He straightened up and his eyes were burning with a terrifying promise. "You have 10 minutes. Then, you are leaving this house forever. With me." Audrey turned and walked toward the stairs with her head held high. She felt his gaze on her back and it was as heavy as a physical touch. He couldn't stop looking at her. And for the first time in her life, Audrey felt powerful. The heavy oak doors of the grand dressing chamber slammed shut with a deafening thud. High brightness flooded the luxurious room from the massive crystal chandeliers hanging above. Clear, cinematic lighting reflected off the polished silver mirrors lining the curved walls. Every corner of the lavish space was illuminated in stunning, vivid detail. Dozens of exquisite silk gowns were displayed gracefully on velvet mannequins. They sparkled under the intense, brilliantly clear light. Audrey stood completely still in the center of the blindingly bright space. She was still wearing her faded, plain cotton dress. Yet, she was strikingly beautiful, radiating a quiet, undeniable grace. Her resilient spirit kept her spine perfectly straight despite the chaos outside. She refused to tremble as the furious, heavy footsteps echoed behind her. Stella stormed into the room with pure hatred burning in her dark eyes. She quickly locked the heavy doors and leaned her back against the polished wood. Stella held a sharp, intricately jeweled dagger in her trembling right hand. "You planned this entire spectacle," Stella hissed through tightly clenched teeth. "You used some wicked trick to steal the Alpha King's attention from me." Audrey slowly turned to face her furiously unhinged older sister. The brilliant, cinematic light caught the calm, intelligent spark in Audrey's eyes. She did not scream in panic for the royal guards. She did not cower in the corner like a frightened animal. "I did nothing but stand in the shadows exactly as I was ordered," Audrey replied softly. "He is a man who made his own absolute choice. He is a king, not a god." Stella screamed in absolute frustration and despair. "The High Council of Ministers will never accept a forgotten, invisible child as their queen. They will test you with impossible trials, they will break your spirit, and they will throw you away." Audrey did not flinch at the empty threat of the royal ministers. She had spent her entire life surviving the daily cruelty of her own family. She possessed a sharp, deeply tactical mind forged by years of silent reading in the dusty library. "If the old men of the council try to break me, they will find I am made of hardened steel," Audrey said smoothly. "I am not a fragile doll waiting to be judged by archaic traditions." Stella let out a bitter, wildly mocking laugh. She raised the sharp dagger and stepped directly into the brightest pool of cinematic light. "I will just ruin that pretty little face right now," Stella threatened maliciously. "Let us see if the great conqueror wants a scarred, bleeding monster for a bride." Before Stella could take another aggressive step forward, the heavy oak doors exploded. They shattered inward with the violent force of a cannon blast. Splinters of expensive wood flew across the brightly lit marble floor. King Julian stepped confidently through the violently ruined doorway. He was athletically built and breathtakingly handsome in the harsh, unforgiving light. There was no mythical magic or monstrous beast hiding within his soul. He was simply a fiercely powerful human conqueror who commanded absolute, terrifying authority. His dark, calculating eyes instantly assessed the dangerous situation in the room. He immediately saw the lethal dagger gleaming in Stella's trembling hand. He also saw the unshakable, quiet courage radiating from Audrey's beautiful face. Julian did not shout for his guards or draw his own massive sword. He moved with the lethal, highly calculated precision of a seasoned military warlord. He crossed the bright room in 3 long strides and grabbed Stella's wrist. His punishing grip forced a sharp, sudden scream from her throat. The jeweled dagger clattered harmlessly onto the cold stone floor. "You dare draw steel in the presence of my chosen queen?" Julian growled softly. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that promised absolute destruction. Stella immediately collapsed to her knees and began sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, my king, she is absolutely nothing," Stella begged helplessly. Julian ignored the weeping, pathetic woman on the floor entirely. He turned his full, undivided attention back to the woman who held his total fascination. The intense, clear lighting highlighted the sharp, handsome angles of his commanding face. He reached into his dark military coat and pulled out a heavy, solid gold emblem. It was the legendary royal crest of the Northern warlords. "Your sister foolishly claims my ministers will test your worth," Julian said smoothly. "She believes the ancient council will demand you prove yourself through endless political trials." He stepped closer and gently pressed the cold gold emblem into Audrey's warm palm. "With this supreme seal, you instantly outrank every minister, every general, and every lord. There will be no archaic trials, no tedious political games, and no questioning your absolute authority. You will never have to prove yourself to a room full of arrogant old men. You answer to no one but me, and I answer to no one but you." Audrey looked down at the heavy gold crest resting heavily in her hand. She immediately realized he was not just giving her an empty royal title. He was actively handing her absolute, unbreakable power over her own political fate. This action was completely unprecedented in the bloody history of the ruling kingdoms. No king had ever bypassed the powerful High Council with such blatant disregard. "Why are you handing me this much untethered power?" Audrey asked quietly. She looked up, meeting his intense gaze without a single hint of fear. Julian reached out and gently traced her delicate, resilient jawline. "Because a ruling king needs an equal partner who does not flinch at a drawn blade. I saw exactly how you stood your ground against her pathetic threats. You do not need a sparkling crown to prove you possess royal blood. Your mind is far sharper than any weapon in my grand armory. Now, tell the terrified servants to find a dress that matches the dangerous fire in your eyes. We are leaving this pathetic, suffocating house in exactly 5 minutes." He turned away and walked slowly back toward the shattered doorway. He paused gracefully and looked back over his broad, highly muscular shoulder. "And Audrey," he added with a dangerously charming, devastating smile. "You are going to help me burn their old, corrupt world completely to the ground." The heavy wheels of the armored royal carriage began to turn with a deep rumble. They crushed the gravel of the family estate driveway without a single moment of hesitation. Inside the spacious cabin, the atmosphere was completely electrified. High brightness filled the carriage from rows of polished gas lamps bolted to the reinforced walls. Clear, cinematic lighting washed over the luxurious velvet seats and intricate brass fittings. Every single detail of the interior was rendered in sharp, vivid clarity. Audrey sat perfectly upright on the edge of the plush, crimson leather seat. She did not look out the thick glass window to watch her childhood home finally disappear. She felt absolutely no regret leaving that terrible prison of quiet neglect. Instead, her steady, intelligent gaze was fixed entirely on the imposing man sitting across from her. King Julian took up a massive amount of space in the brilliantly lit cabin. He was athletically built and breathtakingly handsome in the harsh, revealing light. There was absolutely no bulky, monstrous exaggeration to his powerful, warrior-forged frame. He was simply a devastatingly dangerous human conqueror forged in the fires of endless warfare. He had unbuttoned the high collar of his dark military coat for comfort. The casual action revealed the strong, tanned column of his highly muscular neck. His dark, calculating eyes were already watching her with unwavering intensity. He truly could not stop looking at her. Audrey looked down at her hands resting quietly in her faded lap. Her slender fingers were tightly curled around the solid gold royal crest of the northern warlords. The heavy, priceless metal was still noticeably warm from his previous touch. It was the ultimate symbol of absolute, terrifying political authority. "You are currently holding more power than the entire High Council combined," Julian stated quietly. His deep voice easily cut through the rhythmic sound of the rolling carriage wheels. Audrey slowly raised her head and met his penetrating gaze without a single flinch. She was strikingly beautiful, but it was her resilient spirit that truly commanded the brightly lit room. "You casually gave this to a woman you met less than an hour ago," Audrey replied evenly. "A woman whose own father publicly declared her to be absolutely nothing." Most rational kings would consider this an act of profound, irreversible insanity. Julian leaned forward slightly and the heavy leather seat creaked under his considerable weight. The intense, cinematic lighting cast sharp, attractive shadows beneath his prominent cheekbones. Most rational kings die quickly with poisoned daggers buried deep in their backs, Julian countered smoothly. They stupidly surround themselves with predictable, greedy women who only care about imported silks. They marry into weak, corrupt families desperately hoping to secure fragile peace treaties. He reached across the narrow space and gestured toward the gold crest in her firm hand. "I do not want peace with these pathetic, decaying southern noble houses. I want to completely rebuild this broken kingdom from the foundation upward." Audrey narrowed her bright eyes, quickly processing his dangerous political ambition. "And you somehow believe a hidden, forgotten daughter is the exact key to this grand reconstruction?" she asked. "I watched you standing perfectly still in the shadows of that great hall," Julian explained softly. "You were surrounded by arrogant fools, yet your flawless posture never once broke. You survived years of emotional cruelty without letting them extinguish your quiet fire. When your deranged sister pulled a drawn blade, your pulse did not even quicken." He leaned even closer until she could clearly smell the clean scent of polished leather and cold rain. "You possess a hardened, brilliant tactical mind that the Southern Lords were too stupid to utilize. I am not handing you supreme power because I pity your past, Audrey. I am giving it to you because I know exactly what you are capable of doing with it." Audrey felt a sudden, powerful surge of adrenaline rush fiercely through her veins. No one had ever looked past her plain dresses to see the sharp weapon hidden inside her mind. No one had ever recognized or validated her silent, enduring strength. She slowly opened her hand and stared at the gleaming, intricately carved gold crest. "The High Council will immediately plot to have me quietly assassinated," she stated matter-of-factly. "The Southern Lords will absolutely rebel when they realize I bow to no old traditions." Julian smiled, and it was a devastatingly handsome, fiercely predatory expression. "I am actively counting on them to try," he whispered darkly into the bright space. "Let them reveal their treacherous faces so we can systematically crush them together." Audrey carefully placed the heavy gold crest onto the seat beside her. She sat back, settling comfortably into the luxurious cushions for the very first time in her life. Her resilient beauty seemed to practically glow under the high, cinematic lighting of the lamps. "If I am truly to be your queen," We do things precisely my way when dealing with the royal court, Audrey demanded. I will never be a silent, decorative accessory standing obediently behind your throne. I will be the one who dismantles their corrupt political networks piece by piece. Julian let out a low, deeply satisfied laugh that resonated warmly in the bright cabin. He reached out and gently took her delicate, unadorned hand in his massive, scarred one. He raised her pale knuckles to his lips and pressed a firm, lingering kiss against her skin. I would expect absolutely nothing less from my fated political equal, Julian murmured against her hand. Audrey did not pull her hand away from his surprisingly gentle grasp. His touch sent a completely unfamiliar jolt of electricity straight to her racing heart. Where exactly are we going right now? She asked, keeping her voice completely steady. We are going directly to the Central Command Fortress in the capital city, Julian answered promptly. The old ministers are currently gathered there, waiting to formally meet your older sister. They have prepared a grand, tedious banquet to celebrate securing their newly manipulated puppet. Audrey's mind immediately began to race with brilliant, devastating tactical possibilities. She imagined the absolute shock on their arrogant faces when the king walked in with her instead. We will not enter through the main ceremonial doors like they expect, Audrey instructed sharply. Julian raised one dark, perfectly sculpted eyebrow in genuine, amused curiosity. We will enter through the lower administrative halls where the council secretaries work, she continued rapidly. I want to see the immediate panic in the bureaucracy before the lords even know we have arrived. I want to physically seize the financial ledgers before they have a chance to hide their vast corruption. Julian's dark eyes widened slightly before a look of pure, unrestrained admiration crossed his striking face. He released her hand only to pull a heavy silver flask from his dark military coat. He took a short drink and handed it across the brightly lit space to his new queen. You are infinitely more dangerous than I initially calculated, Julian praised her sincerely. Audrey took the heavy silver flask and took a burning, deeply confident sip. You gave me the power to burn their old world to the ground, Julian, she reminded him coldly. I simply intend to start the fire exactly where it hurts them the absolute most. The royal carriage accelerated wildly toward the sleeping, unsuspecting capital city. Inside the brilliantly illuminated cabin, the most terrifying political alliance in history was officially sealed. There was no mythical magic, no fated supernatural bonds, and absolutely no monstrous beasts. There were only two brilliantly ruthless human minds preparing to conquer an entire continent together. The heavy wheels of the armored royal carriage ground to a sudden, aggressive halt on the cobblestone courtyard. High brightness immediately flooded the area from the massive searchlights positioned strategically on the fortress walls. Clear, cinematic lighting cut through the midnight darkness with absolute, unforgiving precision. The Central Command Fortress stood before them like a mountain of cold, impenetrable grey stone. King Julian stepped out of the carriage first and he moved with lethal, predatory grace. He was athletically built and breathtakingly handsome in the harsh, illuminating light of the compound. There was absolutely no bulky or monstrous awkwardness to his powerful, commanding human frame. He turned back and offered his large, battle-scarred hand to his new, highly unpredictable queen. Audrey accepted his steady hand and stepped gracefully into the blinding pool of light. She was strikingly beautiful and possessed a deeply resilient spirit that radiated from her perfect posture. She did not shiver once in the freezing, biting northern wind. She did not look up in awe at the towering, intimidating walls of the military stronghold. Her sharp, brilliant mind was already calculating her first devastating political strike against the council. The grand banquet hall is located in the upper eastern wing, Julian pointed out smoothly. Then we are going directly to the lower western administrative vaults, Audrey commanded without a second of hesitation. That is exactly where the old council hides its most pathetic, mundane financial secrets. They deliberately walked past the grand marble staircase meant for visiting southern nobility. Instead, They descended a narrow, utilitarian spiral staircase made of cold, solid iron. The heavy double iron doors of the administrative archives were securely locked from the inside. Julian did not bother searching for a lazy guard to retrieve a proper copper key. He simply raised his heavy, steel-toed military boot without breaking his stride. He kicked the massive iron doors with the devastating, explosive force of a siege weapon. The reinforced hinges screamed and shattered violently into twisted, ruined shards of metal. The doors slammed open and revealed a vast, cavernous room filled with towering wooden desks. High brightness filled the expansive archive room from hundreds of gas lamps hanging low from the ceiling. Clear, cinematic lighting beautifully illuminated the endless stacks of parchment and thick leather-bound books. Dozens of terrified clerks and low-ranking bureaucrats froze completely in their uncomfortable wooden chairs. They stared in absolute, paralyzing horror at the violent destruction of their secure entrance. Audrey walked into the brightly lit room with the slow, deliberate confidence of an apex predator. Her faded, simple cotton dress stood in stark contrast to the immense political power she now wielded. Julian followed closely behind her, acting as her silent, terrifying shadow of absolute martial authority. He willingly let her take the lead and completely trusted her brilliant, tactical mind. An older, balding head clerk scrambled desperately out from behind a massive mahogany desk. His ink-stained hands shook violently as he instantly recognized the fearsome warlord of the north. "My king," the terrified clerk stammered and dropped instantly to his trembling knees. "We were not informed of an official royal inspection occurring this evening." Audrey did not even bother to look at the kneeling man's sweating, panicked face. She stepped forward and slammed the solid gold royal crest directly onto his wooden desk. The heavy precious metal made a sharp, echoing crack in the dead silence of the brightly lit room. The clerk stared at the legendary emblem of absolute authority with wide, terrified eyes. "You are not being inspected by the warlord," Audrey stated in a voice like crushed ice. "You are currently being audited by your new queen." The clerks exchanged panicked, desperately confused glances across the illuminated room. They had been explicitly told to prepare marriage documents for Lady Stella of the Sterling House. They had absolutely no idea who this beautiful and resilient woman in peasant clothing was. But they fully recognized the gold crest, and they saw the deadly warning burning in Julian's dark eyes. "I want the private financial ledgers for the southern agricultural districts," Audrey demanded sharply. "I want the classified tax records for the Sterling estate for the last 5 consecutive years. And I want them placed on this specific desk in less than 60 seconds. The head clerk swallowed hard and looked pleadingly toward the towering King Julian. He desperately hoped the king would overrule this completely unprecedented, irregular demand. Julian simply crossed his highly muscular arms over his broad, powerful chest. "If you make her wait 61 seconds, I will personally throw you out of the highest tower window," Julian promised softly. Total, unadulterated panic instantly erupted in the brilliantly lit archive room. Clerks scrambled wildly over each other and desperately pulled heavy books from the towering wooden shelves. Dust danced frantically in the clear, cinematic lighting as they rushed to obey the terrifying command. Exactly 45 seconds later, a massive stack of thick leather ledgers was placed carefully before Audrey. She did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She opened the first heavy book and her bright eyes scanned the complex columns of numbers with terrifying speed. Her cruel father had strictly forbidden her from attending formal social events for her entire life. So, she had spent her entire isolated childhood secretly reading his private financial accounts in the dark. She knew exactly how the corrupt southern lords meticulously hid their stolen wealth. The archive room was completely silent except for the crisp, rhythmic sound of turning pages. Julian watched her sharp, deeply intelligent eyes dart across the faded black ink. He was completely mesmerized by her intense, unwavering focus in the high brightness of the room. 3 minutes later, Audrey slowly closed the final, damning leather ledger. A cold, deeply satisfied smile touched the corners of her beautiful, resilient lips. She looked up and confidently met Julian's waiting, highly expectant gaze. "They are not just casually stealing from the Northern military funds," Audrey announced clearly. Her calm voice carried easily to every single terrified clerk in the silent room. "The High Council ministers have been intentionally starving the border provinces to illegally inflate their own private treasuries. My father, Lord William, is the primary architect of this massive, unforgivable financial treason." A collective gasp of sheer, undeniable terror rippled through the assembled bureaucrats. They knew perfectly well that uttering the word treason in front of Julian meant certain, immediate execution. Audrey placed her pale hand flat against the Deming, heavy leather book. "We do not need to fight the council with drawn swords, Julian," she whispered directly to him. "I am going to completely dismantle their political power by publicly exposing their unbearable greed." Julian let out a low, predatory laugh that echoed ominously off the cold stone walls. "Bring those ledgers," Julian casually ordered the trembling head clerk. "We are going upstairs right now to crash a remarkably tedious banquet." The heavy, gilded doors of the grand banquet hall remained securely closed against the cold northern wind. Inside the massive room, high brightness reflected brilliantly off the polished crystal chandeliers. Clear, cinematic lighting washed over the hundreds of wealthy nobles dressed in their finest imported silks. It illuminated the extravagant, wasteful feast laid out upon the long, silver-plated tables. Lord William Sterling stood proudly at the head of the absolute highest table in the room. He raised a delicate crystal goblet filled with expensive southern wine to propose a grand toast. He was smugly celebrating his brilliant political maneuver to secure the ultimate power of the crown. Stella sat perfectly beside him, already wearing a temporary, highly polished silver tiara. She smiled gracefully at the corrupt ministers of the High Council gathered around her. She truly believed her position as the undisputed Queen of the North was fully secured. She was already planning exactly how she would spend the legendary royal treasury on herself. Suddenly, the joyous, elegant music played by the grand string orchestra abruptly stopped. The massive gilded doors did not just open gently to admit late guests. They were violently thrown apart with the deafening, terrifying crash of heavy iron hitting stone. The sudden, aggressive noise completely shattered the delicate, polite atmosphere of the royal banquet. High brightness spilled intensely from the hallway, outlining two imposing figures standing in the ruined doorway. King Julian walked into the stunned, completely silent room with slow, predatory grace. He was athletically built and breathtakingly handsome under the brilliant, revealing cinematic lighting. There was absolutely no monstrous bulk to his powerful, battle-hardened human physique. He simply radiated the pure, terrifying, unyielding authority of a seasoned military conqueror. But the absolute shock of the gathered nobility was not directed at the imposing warlord. The collective gasp that echoed through the vast hall was entirely for the woman holding his hand. Audrey walked perfectly in step beside the terrifying human king. She was young, strikingly beautiful, and practically glowed with a quiet, highly resilient strength. She still wore her faded, simple cotton dress from the forgotten, dusty shadows of the estate. Yet, she carried herself with the undeniable, effortless poise of an absolute, unquestioned ruler. A terrified, trembling clerk followed closely behind them, carrying a massive stack of thick leather ledgers. Stella dropped her crystal wine glass, and it instantly shattered into 100 sharp pieces on the floor. The dark red wine spilled out like fresh blood under the intense, incredibly clear lights. "What is the exact meaning of this insulting display?" Lord William demanded, his face flushing dark red. "Julian, why have you brought that pathetic, invisible girl into a closed council meeting of state?" Julian completely ignored the arrogant southern lord and led Audrey directly to the center of the room. He gently released her hand and took one deliberate step back, fully yielding the floor to her. This silent, deeply respectful gesture sent a massive shockwave of realization through the gathered politicians. The fearsome northern conqueror was openly deferring to a completely unknown, poorly dressed young woman. Audrey turned her calm, highly intelligent eyes directly toward her furious, panicking father. She gestured sharply to the trembling clerk, who immediately dropped the heavy ledgers onto the nearest silver-plated table. "These are the private financial records of the southern agricultural districts," Audrey announced perfectly clearly. Her steady, uncompromising voice easily reached the furthest corners of the brightly lit banquet hall. "They are the exact numerical records the High Council has desperately kept hidden from the military command." A sudden, suffocating, completely terrified silence fell over the wealthy, highly corrupt ministers. Lord William's face instantly drained of all its angry color, leaving him absolutely pale and shaking. Stella stood up so quickly that her heavy, imported wooden chair crashed violently to the marble floor. "You are lying to the king!" Stella screamed, pointing a violently trembling finger at her younger sister. "You absolutely cannot read or comprehend complex state financial codes. You have never had a professional tutor in your entire miserable, perfectly pathetic life." Audrey looked at her panicking older sister with a mixture of cold pity and absolute, unshakable resolve. "I did not need an expensive tutor to recognize blatant, massive financial treason," Audrey stated smoothly. She stepped forward and slammed her pale hand against the top leather cover of the black ledger. "You intentionally diverted 40% of the Northern Defense budget to your own private banking vaults. You deliberately starved the brave border soldiers to conveniently buy imported gold thread and cheap silver tiaras." The High Council ministers began to sweat profusely under the hot, incredibly intense cinematic lighting. They desperately looked toward the heavily armed royal guards lining the room for immediate physical protection. But the elite northern soldiers only answered to one absolute, terrifying human commander. Julian crossed his highly muscular arms and offered the terrified room a lethal, completely devastating smile. "My chosen queen has just accused the highest lords of the realm of unforgivable, undeniable treason," Julian declared softly. His deep, rumbling voice promised absolute, unrelenting destruction for anyone who dared to move an inch. "Does anyone in this room wish to publicly dispute her brilliant, entirely flawless mathematical calculations?" No one dared to breathe, let alone speak out against the tactical mastermind and the fearsome warlord. The wealthy nobles backed away from the tables as if the extravagant food itself had suddenly become lethally poisoned. Lord William collapsed heavily back into his chair, suddenly realizing his entire political empire was completely destroyed. He had foolishly kept his brightest, most deeply resilient daughter hidden away in the dark for her entire life. Now, she was the exact one standing brilliantly in the light, systematically burning his corrupt world to absolute ashes. Audrey did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for the greedy men who had built their fortunes on suffering. Her brilliant tactical mind had already formulated the next 3 political moves necessary to completely secure the capital. She reached calmly into her simple cotton pocket and slowly pulled out the heavy gold royal crest. The cinematic lighting caught the gold crest perfectly, making it shine like a blinding beacon of absolute justice. She placed it deliberately and forcefully on top of the damning, highly illegal financial ledgers. "The old corrupt council is officially dissolved tonight by the absolute authority of the crown," Audrey pronounced coldly. "And the entire Sterling house will be seized immediately to repay the massive debts owed to the Northern Army." Stella dropped heavily to her knees, her expensive silk gown completely ruined by the sister she had relentlessly abused. Julian looked at Audrey with an expression of pure, unadulterated admiration and incredibly intense romantic desire. He truly, absolutely, and unequivocally could not stop looking at her. The heavy mahogany door of the king's private study clicked softly shut behind them. It completely sealed out the chaotic, terrifying aftermath of the ruined banquet downstairs. High brightness instantly flooded the expansive, deeply private room from towering crystal gas lamps. Clear, cinematic lighting washed over the massive stone walls lined with ancient, detailed military maps. Every single detail of the strategic sanctuary was rendered in stunning, vivid clarity. Audrey walked slowly toward the center of the brilliantly lit, completely silent room. The massive adrenaline rush of publicly taking down the corrupt High Council was finally beginning to fade. She suddenly felt the exhausting, profound weight of the night's incredibly violent political upheaval. Yet, she remained strikingly beautiful, her spine perfectly straight and utterly uncompromising. Her deeply resilient spirit flatly refused to let her collapse, even in absolute privacy. Julian watched her from the heavy doorway with a quiet, intense, and deeply calculating fascination. He was athletically built and breathtakingly handsome in the harsh, unforgiving cinematic light. There was absolutely no bulky, unnatural monstrosity to his powerful, perfectly proportioned human frame. He simply possessed the devastating, lean grace of a hardened, highly experienced battlefield commander. He unclasped his heavy, silver-buttoned military cape and let it fall carelessly to the polished wooden floor. He crossed the bright room with slow, deliberate, incredibly predatory steps. "You completely dismantled a 50-year corrupt regime in less than 10 minutes, Julian observed softly. His deep, rumbling voice vibrated warmly in the quiet, vividly clear space of the study. Audrey turned slowly to face the fearsome, legendary warlord of the North. "My father built his entire political legacy on a fragile foundation of lies and stolen gold," she replied evenly. "I simply provided the necessary, inevitable spark to burn his pathetic illusion completely to the ground." She looked down at her simple, faded cotton dress, which was entirely out of place in the grand royal study. "But the arrogant southern lords will not surrender their stolen wealth without a brutal, desperate fight," she added practically. "They will immediately begin plotting a massive, organized rebellion before the morning sun even rises." Julian stopped just a few inches away from her, deliberately invading her personal space entirely. The intense, cinematic lighting cast sharp, incredibly attractive shadows right beneath his strong, prominent jawline. "Let the southern cowards aggressively plot their pathetic, doomed little rebellions," Julian dismissed casually. "My veteran armies have been patiently waiting for a legitimate excuse to march south for 5 long years." He reached out and gently rested his large, battle-scarred hands heavily on her delicate, tense shoulders. His unexpected touch was shockingly gentle for a man who commanded absolute, terrifying military destruction. "But tonight is no longer about cold military strategy or punishing corrupt, greedy politicians," he murmured deeply. Audrey felt a sudden, powerful electric shiver race rapidly down her spine at his profound, imposing proximity. She looked straight up into his dark, intensely focused, and incredibly observant eyes. She saw no political deception, no cruel manipulation, and absolutely no insulting pity. She only saw raw, unadulterated admiration and a burning, deeply undeniable romantic desire. "You handed absolute supreme power to a hidden, entirely invisible girl tonight," Audrey whispered honestly. "I have never known anything but cold, calculated neglect and daily psychological cruelty my entire life. I spent 10 years secretly reading military history by candlelight while my family proudly feasted above me. I learned exactly how massive empires violently fall from the inside out. But I do not know how to be a traditional, perfectly obedient queen to a powerful human warlord." Julian let out a low, fiercely protective growl that echoed loudly in the bright, silent room. His warm hands slid slowly from her shoulders to gently cup her remarkably beautiful, completely flawless face. "If I desperately wanted a traditional, obedient queen, I would have tragically married your incredibly foolish sister," he stated firmly. "I actively want the fiercely resilient woman who stared down a drawn, lethal dagger without flinching. I strictly want the brilliant, unmatched tactical mind that perfectly calculated high treason in less than 3 minutes. You are the exact, brilliant equal I have been desperately searching for across countless bloody, exhausting battlefields." He leaned down slowly, deliberately closing the tiny distance between their lips in the bright, cinematic light. "You do not need to learn how to be my ruling queen, Audrey," he breathed warmly against her soft skin. "You already undeniably are." His lips finally captured hers in a sudden, deeply passionate, and completely earth-shattering kiss. It was not a brutal or dominating conquest, but a profound, desperately mutual claiming of equal souls. Audrey gasped softly into his mouth as an unfamiliar, intense, and absolutely overwhelming heat flooded her entirely. Her pale hands instinctively reached up to grip the solid, highly muscular lapels of his dark military coat. She anchored herself desperately to the imposing, incredibly handsome man who had finally seen her true, hidden worth. Julian wrapped his remarkably strong arms securely around her slender waist, pulling her flush against his athletic chest. He tasted beautifully like expensive southern wine, clean northern rain, and absolute, thrilling, undeniable danger. For the very first time in her isolated, deeply painful life, Audrey did not feel like a forgotten, worthless shadow. She felt completely, undeniably visible and deeply cherished in the intense, brilliantly clear, cinematic light. Julian slowly pulled back, breaking the intense kiss just enough to look deep into her widened, beautiful eyes. His breathing was slightly uneven, his broad chest heaving heavily under his dark, perfectly tailored military coat. "Tomorrow, we officially declare absolute, unyielding war on the remaining corrupt southern nobility," he promised darkly. "Tomorrow, you will brutally and systematically restructure the entire broken financial system of this kingdom." He brushed his rough thumb gently and reverently across her swollen, perfectly pink lower lip. "But for the rest of tonight, you belong entirely to me, and I belong completely and totally to you." Audrey smiled, a genuinely breathtaking, deeply authentic, and dangerously confident expression. "Then you had better be completely prepared for a long night, Julian," she whispered with a sudden, challenging spark in her bright eyes. "Because I absolutely never surrender once a deeply important battle has truly begun." Julian laughed, a rich, deeply joyous sound that completely filled the high brightness of the private room. He effortlessly lifted her into his strong, capable arms, securely carrying his brilliant, highly resilient queen toward his inner chambers. The massive political war for the kingdom was just beginning, but the crucial battle for her guarded soul was already completely won. The freezing northern dawn finally broke over the towering stone walls of the central command fortress. High brightness flooded the massive command room from the rapidly rising eastern sun. Clear, cinematic lighting completely washed away the deep, intimate shadows of the long, passionate night. Audrey stood gracefully by the massive arched window overlooking the vast capital courtyard. She was no longer wearing the faded, pathetic cotton dress of a forgotten, heavily abused daughter. She was dressed in a stunning, deep crimson gown made of heavy, flawlessly cut imported silk. It was completely unadorned by useless, heavy jewels, radiating pure, deeply resilient power. She looked striking, beautiful, and completely ready for absolute, unforgiving political war. King Julian walked up slowly behind her, his footsteps heavy, rhythmic, and deeply confident. He was fully dressed in his dark, perfectly tailored, incredibly imposing military uniform. He remained athletically built and breathtakingly handsome in the harsh, revealing morning light. There was absolutely nothing monstrous or awkwardly bulky about his flawless, highly trained human frame. He wrapped his strong, heavily scarred arms securely around her incredibly narrow waist. He rested his sharp chin gently against her shoulder, looking out at the rapidly waking city. The corrupt southern lords have predictably rallied their expensive private mercenary armies, Julian murmured softly. Their desperate, highly disorganized forces are currently marching toward the main fortress gates. Audrey did not flinch, panic, or show a single sign of traditional, expected feminine fear. Her incredibly sharp, deeply tactical mind had already perfectly anticipated this exact, foolish maneuver. They are deeply arrogant, incredibly predictable, and exceptionally stupid men, Audrey replied coldly. They truly believe their stolen agricultural gold can effortlessly buy loyal soldiers in the freezing north. Julian turned her gently in his warm arms, his dark eyes burning with intense, undeniable admiration. My heavy cavalry is already heavily positioned in the surrounding western hills, he assured her confidently. We will systematically crush their pathetic, desperate rebellion before the sun ever reaches noon. Audrey reached up and gently touched the cold silver medals pinned perfectly to his broad chest. You will not need to violently sacrifice a single northern soldier today, Julian, she stated calmly. Julian raised one dark, perfectly sculpted eyebrow in genuine, highly amused, complete curiosity. What exactly did you do in the lower administrative vaults last night? He asked with a dangerously charming smile. I did not merely locate the damning, irrefutable written evidence of their massive, unforgivable treason, Audrey explained quietly. I used your gold royal seal to immediately transfer all their frozen banking assets directly to the crown. I systematically and completely drained their secret, highly guarded mercenary payroll accounts before midnight. Julian let out a low, deeply impressed laugh that vibrated warmly against her slender body. You managed to completely bankrupt an entire rebellion before they even drew their expensive swords, he realized with dark joy. I absolutely purchased the permanent, highly motivated loyalty of their own hired soldiers, Audrey corrected smoothly. The heavy, deafening warning bells of the central fortress suddenly began to ring with terrifying volume. The massive, highly disorganized Southern army was violently breaching the outer cobblestone city squares. Let us go out to the highest command balcony immediately, Audrey suggested with completely unwavering confidence. I passionately want to physically watch my father realize his entire corrupt political world is completely destroyed. Julian offered his strong arm, treating her with the absolute, profound respect of a true, undisputed equal. They walked perfectly together out onto the massive, freezing, windswept stone balcony of the highest tower. High brightness instantly blinded the completely terrified Southern soldiers looking desperately up at them. Clear, cinematic lighting perfectly illuminated the terrifying, legendary warlord and his brilliant, fiercely beautiful new queen. Lord William sat nervously on a white horse at the absolute front of his expensive, heavily armed mercenary army. He desperately pointed his drawn, shaking steel sword up at the towering, impenetrable stone balcony. Surrender the fortress immediately, Julian? William shouted violently, his voice cracking with undeniable, pathetic panic. You are completely outnumbered by the finest, most heavily armed paid soldiers in the entire southern kingdom. Julian did not bother to aggressively shout back at the pathetic, deeply corrupt, highly treacherous man. He simply looked down affectionately at Audrey, waiting completely and happily for her brilliant, decisive command. Audrey stepped completely forward, leaning her pale, beautiful hands heavily on the cold stone railing. Her steady, uncompromising voice carried easily over the deafening noise of the massive, chaotic army below. Commander of the Iron Company. Audrey called out with absolutely flawless, terrifyingly perfect projection. A massive, heavily armored mercenary leader slowly rode his black horse forward to the absolute front lines. He completely ignored the frantic, desperate, highly confusing shouting of Lord William right next to him. Did you safely receive the massive Northern Royal Treasury transfer this morning? Audrey asked clearly. The hardened mercenary commander looked straight up into the intense, cinematic light bathing the resilient new queen. He slowly raised his heavy, steel-clad fist and slammed it deeply and respectfully against his armored chest. The massive gold payment is completely secured, Your Majesty, the mercenary roared with absolute, deafening loyalty. Lord William's arrogant face instantly drained of absolutely all color, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost. He frantically looked around as his own expensive, heavily armed soldiers slowly drew their incredibly sharp weapons. They were absolutely not pointing their deadly swords at the towering, impenetrable northern military fortress. They were pointing them directly, purposefully, and lethally at Lord William and the remaining, completely terrified southern nobles. "Arrest every single corrupt traitor holding a southern noble banner," Audrey commanded with cold, absolute, terrifying finality. "Throw them all instantly into the deepest, darkest, absolutely inescapable military dungeons underneath this fortress." Total, unadulterated, incredibly violent chaos instantly erupted in the brightly lit courtyard far below them. The grand, highly anticipated battle was completely and utterly over before a single drop of northern blood was ever shed. Julian wrapped his heavy, incredibly warm military cape entirely around Audrey's slender, deeply resilient shoulders. He pulled her back safely against his athletically built, flawlessly handsome, highly protective human body. "You are the most terrifying, absolutely magnificent creature I have ever met in my entire life," Julian whispered deeply into her ear. Audrey leaned back securely against him, feeling perfectly safe, incredibly powerful, and deeply, authentically loved. The harsh, intensely brilliant morning light continued to perfectly illuminate their absolute, unquestioned, highly dominant victory. There were absolutely no cheap magic tricks, no supernatural beasts, and absolutely no old, tedious council trials. There was only pure, unyielding human intelligence, brilliant tactical strategy, and a deeply unbreakable, fiercely passionate bond. The massive, intricately carved iron doors of the Grand Royal Cathedral swung open with a deafening, triumphant echo. High brightness immediately flooded the vast, towering sanctuary from thousands of perfectly polished crystal gas lamps. Clear, cinematic lighting beautifully washed over the endless rows of heavily armored, fiercely loyal northern soldiers standing at perfect attention. Every single inch of the magnificent hall was illuminated flawlessly, completely banishing any lingering historical shadows from the ancient stone walls. Audrey stood confidently at the absolute threshold of her entirely new, brilliantly conquered political world. She was strikingly beautiful and practically glowed with an unbreakable, deeply resilient spirit that demanded absolute respect. She was no longer dressed in the faded, pathetic cotton rags of a heavily abused, forgotten southern daughter. Instead, she wore a breathtaking, perfectly tailored gown of deep midnight blue velvet interwoven with heavy silver thread. The heavy fabric trailed gracefully behind her on the polished marble floor with every slow, deliberate step she took. King Julian stood waiting for her at the very end of the long, brightly lit central aisle. He was athletically built and breathtakingly handsome under the harsh, incredibly revealing cinematic lighting of the cathedral. There was absolutely no monstrous bulk or awkward, unnatural exaggeration to his perfectly proportioned, powerful human frame. He possessed the devastating, lean, highly lethal grace of a seasoned military conqueror who had officially won his greatest war. There were absolutely no corrupt, whispering southern politicians allowed inside this sacred, highly secure space today. The old, treacherous High Council was completely dissolved and their members were locked securely in the freezing lower dungeons. Lord William and the violently jealous Stella were currently rotting in the absolute darkest cells beneath this very floor. They were forced to listen helplessly to the deafening, joyous military trumpets celebrating the incredible rise of the sister they had thrown away. Audrey walked down the aisle with her head held high, completely owning the terrifying, absolute power she had brilliantly secured. She felt the heavy, admiring gazes of 1,000 battle-hardened veterans who now viewed her as their undisputed tactical goddess. Julian stepped forward to meet her, completely ignoring all ancient, tedious royal protocols that demanded he wait at the altar. He reached out and gently took both of her pale, steady hands in his massive, deeply scarred ones. The intense, cinematic light caught the brilliant, fiercely passionate spark burning deeply within his dark, calculating eyes. "You have completely saved my kingdom from rotting entirely from the inside out," Julian murmured, his voice resonating through the silent hall. You prove that a brilliant human mind is vastly superior to any drawn sword or expensive mercenary army. Audrey smiled softly, her deeply resilient heart swelling with a profound, completely unfamiliar sense of total belonging. We fundamentally saved this broken kingdom together, Julian, she replied evenly, her voice carrying absolute, unshakable conviction. I simply provided the precise mathematical strategy, and you provided the absolute, terrifying courage to execute it. Julian let out a low, deeply affectionate laugh that vibrated warmly in the high brightness of the massive cathedral. He turned to a small velvet cushion resting on a marble pedestal, completely bypassing the nervous, waiting high priest. He picked up a stunning, exceptionally unique crown forged entirely from dark northern steel and flawless, brilliant cut diamonds. It was not a fragile, purely decorative piece of gold jewelry meant for a weak, submissive southern bride. It was a heavy, commanding symbol of absolute, terrifying martial authority and unmatched political genius. Julian turned back to Audrey, looking down at her beautiful, perfectly composed face with pure, unadulterated devotion. I do not need the permission of any god, priest, or corrupt council to formally declare you my equal, Julian announced loudly. His powerful voice echoed off the brilliantly lit stone ceiling, easily reaching the ears of every single loyal soldier present. You conquered this empire with your unmatched intelligence, and you conquered my guarded soul with your unbreakable fire. He slowly and deliberately lowered the heavy steel and diamond crown onto her dark, perfectly styled hair. I crown you Audrey, the absolute, undisputed queen of the North, and the supreme commander of my entire heart, he declared passionately. A massive, deafening roar of pure, unfiltered joy violently erupted from the thousands of heavily armed soldiers in the room. They repeatedly slammed their heavy steel swords against their metal shields in a terrifying, magnificent display of ultimate loyalty. Audrey did not flinch or cower at the incredibly loud, violent noise of her new, highly lethal military family. She stood perfectly still, her spine straight, fully absorbing the magnificent, undeniable reality of her total victory. Julian reached out and gently pulled her flush against his broad, athletic chest, silencing the room with a single raise of his hand. Are you completely prepared to rule this massive, newly rebuilt world with me? He whispered intimately against her lips. I have been completely prepared for this exact moment my entire life, Audrey whispered back, her bright eyes blazing with confidence. Julian leaned down and captured her lips in a deeply passionate, earth-shattering kiss that completely sealed their unbreakable alliance. It was a kiss that promised absolute destruction to their enemies and endless, terrifyingly beautiful devotion to each other. The cinematic lighting perfectly framed their embraced silhouettes against the towering, magnificent stained glass windows. There was absolutely no mythical magic needed to explain the profound, undeniable magnetic pull between their resilient human souls. Audrey finally broke the kiss, breathing heavily, but she remained securely anchored in his strong, intensely protective arms. She looked up at the breathtakingly handsome king who had violently pulled her out of the cold, forgotten shadows. He was staring down at her with the exact same intense, all-consuming hunger he had shown on that very first day. The brutal political wars were officially over, the traitors were permanently locked away, and the massive kingdom was finally theirs. But as King Julian held his brilliant, fiercely beautiful queen in the blinding, high brightness of the cathedral, one absolute truth remained. He simply, truly, and absolutely couldn't stop looking at her. Audrey spent years in quiet neglect, secretly reading military history and financial ledgers. While her sister, Stella, focused on imported gold thread and rehearsed smiles, Audrey was forging a spirit of hardened steel. When King Julian, a dangerous conqueror, who moved with the grace of an apex predator, entered the hall, he didn't see the gold, he saw the fire in the shadows. His obsession wasn't just romantic, he recognized her as his fated political equal. If you were Audrey, would you have kept your father and sister in the deepest, darkest military dungeons, Or was there a part of you that hoped for a final confrontation where they had to apologize? Brain versus brawn. In a genre filled with magic tricks and supernatural bonds, how refreshing was it to see a queen win a war by completely draining her enemies' bank accounts before they could even draw their swords? The Julian factor. Julian famously couldn't stop looking at her from the moment they met. Do you think he fell for her beauty first, or was it the moment she stood her ground against a lethal dagger that truly sealed his devotion? If you had the royal crest of the northern warlords in your hand right now, what is the first corrupt tradition you would burn to the ground?